behind the towering black stone walls of the royal citadel in Duranza, there thrived a world unseen by most. It was a secret realm not ruled by generals or counselors, but by whisperers, silent alliances, and the ambition of women born into, or thrust into a brutal system. For nearly 300 years, the emperors of the House of Makanan ruled over the kingdom of Valeria. But behind them stood the most elaborate, secretive, and treacherous harem institution the empire had ever known. These weren't just women chosen for pleasure. They were strategic assets, political pawns, vessels for producing heirs, and silent players in a deadly game where the prize was survival and power. From low-ranking handmaidens to empresses who could bend an emperor's will, this is the buried story of dominance, betrayal, jealousy, and forgotten black women who shaped a mighty kingdom from the shadows, all hidden behind the gates of the royal fortress. For centuries, across countless dynasties in Illyrian history, one tradition endured: the emperor's harem. From the legendary Emperor Ezron the Golden to the last sovereign ruler, young Caleb Asante, every monarch was surrounded by an army of consorts and concubines. While stories and plays painted these women as romantic companions or tragic figures, their true role was far more complex and deeply strategic. These women weren't just present to entertain the emperor. They served two crucial purposes. First, they were essential tools for forging political alliances. Marriages and appointments to the harem allowed noble families to secure their position close to the throne, tightening their influence over national affairs. But more importantly, the women of the harem were expected to bear sons who would carry on the emperor's bloodline, preserving the dynasty and its grip on power. In this account, we'll uncover the hidden mechanics of one of history's most fascinating and tightly controlled harem systems, the one crafted by the Qing Dynasty of Illyria. We'll examine how this ruling family, descended from warriors of the Northern Highlands, adapted ancient traditions to suit their reign, and how it shaped life behind the towering black stone walls of the royal citadel. The rise of the Qing family marked the final imperial chapter of Illyria. But unlike earlier dynasties, the Qings weren't from the majority Solari people. They were Highlanders, fierce clansmen from the icy cliffs of Ankara who marched into the capital of Beluva in the year 1644, toppling the crumbling Solari regime and seizing the Golden Throne. At the heart of this monumental shift stood a child emperor. Barely 5 years old, Malik Jonas, son of the Highland warlord Hailu Makanan. Though Malik was given the crown, the real authority rested with his uncle, Prince Damaris, a hardened regent who guided the empire through its volatile early years under Makanan rule. With Damaris's protection, young Malik became the first Makanan emperor to receive the divine mandate and rule all of Illyria from within the royal citadel. It was during his reign that the structure of the imperial harem began to solidify, and one rule towered above all others. All concubines were to be chosen almost exclusively from noble Highland or coastal Umari bloodlines. This wasn't just a preference, it was policy. It was a carefully engineered strategy to preserve the Makanan bloodline and separate it from the broader Solari population and other ethnic groups across the empire. Of course, the rule was occasionally bent. Historical scrolls show that during the Makanan reign, a handful of Solari and even one Eastern Gelen woman were chosen as concubines. But these were rare exceptions. It wasn't until Malik's son, Emperor Jabari, rose to power that the harem system was fully refined, constructed a framework so rigid and deliberate that it would remain nearly unchanged for more than 250 years. So how did a young black girl from the Highlands or coast find herself in the harem of the most powerful man in the empire? The journey was intense, intimidating, and meticulously orchestrated. And for those chosen, it was the beginning of a life lived in silence, shadows, and unforgiving scrutiny. Every 3 years, noble families from across Illyria's 8 pillars, the military and aristocratic clans of the Highlanders and Umari, were summoned to send their eligible daughters for royal selection. These young black girls, typically between 13 and 16, were carefully prepared by their households before being escorted to the capital of Beluva. They came dressed in ceremonial silk, with eyes full of hope or fear, knowing they might never return home. If a girl was too ill to travel or faced logistical issues, she would be required to attend the next round, no exceptions. On the designated day, hundreds of girls entered the royal citadel not through the grand marble gates, but through the discreet passage of quiet grace, a rear entrance, far from the royal court and public eyes. It was a reminder, though noble. By birth, their lives would now be judged in silence. Behind closed doors, each girl was accompanied by her parents or elders and escorted by her clan leaders. Once inside, they faced the first wave of judgment. Appearance and composure were everything. Their posture, skin clarity, poise, and the way they held their eyes, all were scrutinized. Those who didn't meet the expectations were sent home. Immediately, the ones deemed worthy were registered as villein, or maidens of the palace. But that was only the beginning. The next phase went deeper. Intelligence, artistic talents, manners, and family history were assessed. Its elders of the royal household watched closely as the girls recited poetry, played instruments, and spoke of philosophy or scripture. Gradually, the crowd of hopefuls narrowed to a few dozen. The final stage took place before the court of radiant balance, where the emperor made his selections, though his choices weren't completely his own. His mother, the Queen Dowager, or a former empress, if he was still young, had the final say. The ideal candidate had beauty, health, intellect, and political usefulness. In theory, the emperor could select as many concubines as he wanted. Some girls were even chosen to become empress if the position was vacant. In reality, only 5 women in the entire Makanan era entered the palace with the title of empress from the start. Most, no matter how graceful or refined, had to climb the hierarchy over time, often painfully. Those not selected by the emperor were sometimes offered as wives or concubines to royal cousins, dukes, or high-ranking generals. Others returned home in silence. But for many, especially those from lesser noble lineages, entry into the palace began not as concubines, but as attendants of the night chamber palace maids. Each year, smaller noble houses sent their daughters to serve the empress and her court. These young women were expected to give up their previous lives entirely. Once within the royal citadel, they rarely saw their families again. They worked long hours, cared for the concubines, learned to keep secrets, and performed rituals for the imperial ancestors. Most were released at age 25 if they wished, but many didn't leave. Some stayed until 35, and a very rare few saw their fates change completely if they caught the emperor's attention. One of the most extraordinary stories was that of Empress Manali Saraya. Born a Solari commoner and taken in as a servant, she rose through the ranks quietly. Her calm demeanor, wisdom, and voice eventually won over Emperor Jabari himself. She was elevated first to noble consort and later posthumously honored as Empress. Her son, Prince Azarian, would become one of the most influential emperors in Illyrian history, but her journey was anything but typical for most women. The climb was steep, the cost high, and the rules brutal. Favor could elevate, jealousy could destroy, and the ability to bear a son? That was the one power every woman was silently fighting for, because in the shadows of the royal citadel, giving life to a prince didn't just mean survival. It meant power. Once inside the emperor's harem, a woman's entire life was defined by rank. Her status determined everything from the size of her chamber to the number of servants who addressed her. From what she ate to how often she could be seen by the emperor himself, this hierarchy wasn't symbolic. It dictated survival. At the bottom were the second-class attendants, known in court language as Nurel. The emperor could appoint as many Nurel as he desired. Each had 2 personal maids, giving them slightly more recognition than ordinary servants. But they held no real power and often existed in a fog of invisibility. One level above were the first-class attendants, called Sorel. Like the Nirel, their numbers were unlimited. But each had 3 maids and a little more presence in the daily rhythm of palace life. They were noticed, occasionally favored, but rarely influential. Next came the noble ladies, or Girani. Each had 4 personal servants and shared living quarters with others of the same rank. They were not royalty, but their names were logged. In the Book of the Inner Court, the Girani formed the broad foundation of the harem scene, whispered about and often overlooked by those higher up. But then came the true threshold of influence. The imperial concubines, or avelas, were strictly limited to 6 at any one time. Each avela commanded 6 palace servants and wielded authority over the lower ranks. They acted as mediators, enforcers, and occasionally confidants. If a noble lady hoped to rise, she needed an avela's support or her downfall. Above them stood the consorts, known as feari. Only 4 women could hold this title. With 8 personal servants each and the right to oversee select eunuchs, the trusted male attendants of the palace feari had access not only to the emperor, but to palace information. They influenced appointments, punishments, and sometimes even policy. Next came the noble consorts, or geril. Only 2 women could bear this rank. They lived in private wings of the palace and had command over entire clusters of attendants and guards. These women weren't just harem figures. They were symbols of clan strength, often positioned to act as political counterweights within the royal court. Just below the throne sat the imperial noble consort, known as Huangara. There could only be one, though her household matched that. Of the Gero, her influence eclipsed them. Huangara often stood in as head of the harem, if the empress was absent or not yet appointed. The emperor rarely gave this title lightly. It was often reserved for a woman he intended to elevate further, or for one he trusted to keep peace among rival women. At the very top stood the Empress, the emperor's only official wife, known in ancient Illyrian as the Ishtara. Contrary to tales of love and passion, the Ishtara was rarely chosen for beauty or charm. Her selection was political. Her lineage had to be noble, her reputation unblemished, her demeanor rooted in discipline and dignity. She was expected to be the mother of the nation, a living embodiment of Illyrian virtue, wisdom, and control. The Ishtara's real authority came not from her closeness to the emperor, but from her control over the other women. Though protocol required only one official visit from the emperor each month, she was the one who set the tone in the palace, mentored new maidens, and approved or challenged household decisions. She was the symbolic mother of all imperial children, whether she birthed them or not. Yet within this towering ladder of titles, only one path offered true security: motherhood, specifically the birth of a son. Bearing a male heir could elevate a woman overnight from obscurity to power. It could protect her from rivals, secure her rank, and in time, earn her the title of Empress Dowager, or Ishtara Mayan, the mother of the reigning emperor, and often the true power behind the throne. But even here, politics complicated everything. When Emperor Azarian died, both his official wife, Empress Kalina, and his favored consort, Lady Shan, the biological mother of the new emperor, were granted the title of Ishtara Mayan. While Kalina held the ceremonial title, it was Lady Shan who gained real control. Her son's love and her own fierce intelligence transformed her into the legendary Empress Dowager Shan Mayon, one of the most influential and feared rulers. In Illyrian history, in rare cases, when a woman lived long enough to see her grandson crowned, she was granted the highest maternal honor, Grand Empress Dowager or Ishtara Majora. Such was the case for Grand Empress Dowager Azeline, raised and guided the young Emperor Jabari after his father's early death. But within the harem's golden walls, too much ambition could be dangerous. A woman who rose too fast or too boldly became a target. Jealous rivals whispered in the shadows. Old families stirred against her. Court scholars frowned. Without the birth of a son to justify her rise, she could fall hard. One brutal reminder was the fall of Consort Demera during Emperor Jabaris. Reign Demera struck a palace girl in a fit of jealousy. Girl died. The emperor, furious, stripped Demera of her rank and cast her into isolation. No alliance, No favor, no beauty could save her. Inside the royal citadel, nothing was permanent, only the emperor's will. And the child a woman carried could grant her a place in history, for thousands of women behind the black stone walls. Of the royal citadel, life in the emperor's harem wasn't the luxury most imagined. It was quiet, repetitive, isolating, and often suffocating. The imperial harem was housed in the 12 sanctums, a complex divided into the 6 eastern and 6 western palaces of Beluva, dedicated solely to the emperor's women. Women, Narelle, Sorel, and Girani, lived in shared chambers, often cramped and filled with quiet tension. The higher one rose, the more space and privacy she received. By the time a woman became a Fayari, or Garel, she could claim her own richly furnished wing, with private gardens and painted ceilings, guarded gates, and embroidered tapestries. But regardless of rank, the rhythm of daily life was eerily the same. Most mornings began with ritual cleansing, followed by quiet strolls through the gardens. Midday was filled with activities meant to distract: board games made of ivory and gold, sketching landscapes, embroidery, playing ancient flutes, reading poems aloud to no one. Even the pets they were allowed to keep: small cats, colorful birds. Gentle hounds were chosen more for decorum than affection. Some women spent decades within those stone walls and never once stepped beyond the citadel gates. They watched seasons change through narrow windows and heard distant music from festivals they were never allowed to attend. For the unfavored, those not summoned to the emperor's chambers, the palace felt less like a court and more like a beautifully decorated cage. But for the lucky few, there were exceptions. Women ranked Fayari or higher, or those particularly beloved by the emperor, were sometimes invited on royal excursions, hunting trips into the green reaches, river ceremonies, or diplomatic parades. Known for taking his favorite Avela, Lady Halisi, on his southern journey through Ducora province, it was the talk of the entire palace, not because of love, but because of the risk. Even in freedom, a harem woman was bound. According to Highlander and Solari law, once a woman entered the emperor's harem, she could never remarry. Not even after the emperor's death. She was his, in name and in soul, even beyond the grave. When an emperor died, the lives of his concubines didn't end, but they were quietly redirected. Those without sons were moved to the sanctum of still waters, where they lived out their days in seclusion, widowed by empire. Those who bore princes but didn't become Ishtar Mayan were granted quarters in the sanctum of serenity and blessing, carefully distanced from the new ruler's circle. Some women lived 40 or 50 years after their emperor died, watching a new generation of concubines rise. While they faded into quiet corners of the palace, their names were remembered in the imperial registers. Their rooms were sealed with their favorite scents. But their stories, their voices, and their longings were buried beneath protocol. And yet, even in widowhood, a concubine's rank could still shift. Future emperors had the power to promote or demote the women of past reigns. Sometimes they did so to honor their father's memory, sometimes they did it out of spite, and sometimes for political favor with certain clans. They would rewrite a woman's title altogether, altering how history would remember her. The system was built to endure. It lasted through rebellions, famines, invasions. It shaped court decisions, succession plans, and inner palace politics. But it also shaped and consumed the lives of the women trapped inside. Every rank, every favor, every child born, every mistake whispered, it was all part of a code of silent survival, and the walls of the royal citadel remembered everything as the 20th century neared. The mighty system of the Makanan harem began to crack. The kingdom of Ilaria once ruled with unquestioned power from behind the citadels. Black stone walls was now facing rebellion, foreign invasions, the cries of a people desperate for change. The dynasty's grasp weakened. In 1912, the Great Dusk Revolution erupted, and the royal court was stripped of its authority. The empire collapsed into a republic. But even after the fall, the royal citadel remained frozen in time. The last emperor, Caleb Asante, a boy crowned, too young, was kept within the palace as a figurehead, surrounded by customs, rituals, and ghostly echoes of a dying dynasty. At just 16 years old, Caleb was told to choose an empress and a consort, not from noble gatherings, not through selection ceremonies in the passage of quiet grace, but through photographs. Tradition collapsed into still images. He chose Zaya Maren to be empress and Shira Lonel as his consort, trying to breathe life into a hollow legacy. But the illusion didn't last. 2 years later, 1924, Warlord General Faisal Dinari stormed the capital during Alaria's internal civil war. He ordered the complete expulsion of the royal family from the citadel. 5 centuries of imperial residence ended that day. Caleb, Zaya, Shira fled to the foreign-controlled Crescent Quarter of Dejina. Their titles meant nothing now. Their guards were gone. Their names were whispered in pity, not fear. In 1931, the final wound was struck. Zaya Maren, once chosen as empress by photograph, walked into the broken court and said 4 words that shattered what remained of the Qing Harem system. "I want a divorce." It was unprecedented. In that moment, centuries of ritual silence and submission were buried. The Qing Harem was no more. Over nearly 300 years, the imperial harem of Alaria had been a world of quiet hierarchies, dangerous ascents, invisible power, and brutal downfall. It was a system where jealousy was whispered behind embroidered fans, where women bore sons not for joy but for security, and where survival meant knowing when to speak and when to disappear. Today, historians, poets, and playwrights still return to that world. They romanticize it. They dramatize the stories of women like Empress Manali, Soraya, Empress Dowager, Shan Mayan, or the tragic consort Demara. They turn survival into legend, rivalry into art. But behind the art was the truth. These women lived inside gilded prisons. Their futures were not theirs. Their fates belonged to the emperor, the blood of their sons, and the sharp edges of palace politics. The Qing Dynasty has fallen. The royal citadel stands silent. But the whispers of those women, their ambition, their pain, their endurance still live behind the walls of history, and they always will.